Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. This is David Helvarg, and with both Vicky and Natasha off on summer travel, I'm thrilled to have as our co-host this time, Leilei Shih, an oceanographer and Blue Frontier board member. Hi, Leilei.
Hello, it's wonderful to be back.
I've also been on the road promoting my new book, Forest of the Sea, The Remarkable Life and Imperiled Future of Kelp, which is a reason I'm particularly delighted to welcome as our guest Dr. Eger, one of the world's top kelp scientists and advocates. Based at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where he's joining us from tomorrow morning, our time, Erin is founder and program director of the Kelp Forest Alliance and the lead author on 3 major scientific kelp reports that have come out over the last 3 years. He's also winner of several prestigious prizes, including one for emerging leaders in science. So we'll get into all that, but first, some Blue News you can use. Welcome to more Blue News you can use. First, some good news. Our last Blue News was about the Trump administration's attempt to dismantle a vast $365 million deep ocean observing system, mainly because it was producing cutting-edge science on how climate change is impacting our world. Luckily, like an 8th grade bully when confronted by a brave kid, or in this case widespread opposition, Trump's National Science Foundation promised to stop doing what it was doing and even put back the gear they'd taken out of the ocean off of Oregon. Of course, if this oil-drenched administration were successful in suppressing all science, they could point to a cold blob of frosty water in the North Atlantic and claim it is proof that the ocean really isn't being overheated by the burning of coal, oil, and gas. In fact, scientists think the cold blob indicates AMOC is going amok. AMOC is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, a vast oceanic conveyor belt that brings warm tropical water into the North Atlantic. They fear a slowdown in the circulation by as much as 20%. If this continues, it could lead to a long-term mini ice age in Europe that's now going through a deadly heat wave, as well as rapidly rising sea levels on the US Atlantic coast and global disruptions of African rainfall, Asian monsoons, and global agriculture. So, like that 8th grade bully, we can do unsupervised chemical experiments in our science class that's now the planet, or we can be brave and, among other things, vote the ocean this November. And that's Blue News you can use. Okay, welcome back. Erin, before we get entangled in the kelp, maybe you can tell us what we ask most of our guests, which is, how did you first connect with the ocean?
Hi, David. Hi, Leilei. I think the ocean has always just been this kind of ever-present background in my life, and it slowly kind of, like the tide perhaps, increased and crept forward. And growing up, it was just there, kind of silently perhaps shaping an interest in it. And then you start to, dip your toe in the water, then you dive in the water, then you start snorkeling, then you start scuba diving, then you start building your career around it. It's just always been there on the west coast of Canada, more specifically is where I grew up, around Vancouver, on a small kind of coastal community. And you could see it from our house. We'd spend our summers by the beach. And it really just, again, became this ever-increasing presence in my life.
And how did you get from being on the beach in the cold waters of British Columbia to studying the beach, the ocean? What was your career course from your childhood?
So the core kind of motivation that I was trying to figure out what to do with my career was how I could protect the place that I grew up and really cherished and valued and imprinted on me, which was coastal British Columbia. And then thought maybe science. Science could be the way that I could protect, manage, improve the environment that I cherish so much. And so I went down undergrad, honors, master's, and then partway kind of between master's and PhD, realized, yes, we need the science, but we need a lot more than the science. We need people to care about kelp forests. We need politicians to write laws. We need businesses to adapt their practices to invest in kelp conservation. And so now I've kind of merged from kelp scientist to kelp conservationist, kelp hugger, someone who tries to bring together all these different sort of parts of society that are linked to the ocean, to kelp forest, and have them work together to help our kelp.
And so you studied kelp because you grew up around it.
Yeah. I cared about the ocean, and kelp was the thing that threaded together the ocean where I grew up. It was the coral reef of Vancouver, of Canada. It was really the fabric of the temperate seas that I cared so much about.
I think a lot of times people think kelp forests are restricted to small portions of coastlines or regions, but of course, kelp forests are found all over the world. David and I live in California, so we're also most familiar with the kelp on the west coast of North America. But there are kelp forests on every continent. What are some of the same challenges kelp forests from around the world share with each other, and what are some of the differences?
I think that is the really beautiful part about kelp forests, is that we have them in so many different geographies and cultures, and people connect to them in different but very similar ways. But across the world's kelp forests, they're facing three kind of main threats. First, as our oceans are getting warmer, kelp are cold adapted species, so they don't like that increase in temperature, and that can push them over an edge, so they're no longer able to reproduce or survive or create the next generation. And then second, we have the loss of top predators that would eat sea urchins. Sea urchins are these spiky herbivores that love to eat kelp forests themselves. And so when we take out the things that eat sea urchins, like big predatory fish or lobsters, then the sea urchins can just grow and grow and grow and grow and expand in number. And then lastly, we have the more kind of benign urban development as we modify our coastlines, develop them, turn what were sort of healthy living reefs into fixed structures, increase sediment pollution in the water. And that's just having a really negative downturn on kelp forests.
Without swift climate action to abate the warming of oceans, do other forms of restoration efforts stand a chance in the long run?
They do in some places. So the kind of optimistic thing about kelp forests, at least in my opinion, is there's no future without them. We're not going to lose all of our kelp forests. We might lose some, or they might shift, but kelp is very adaptable. And so even in the future that we're facing, we will find different populations of kelp forests that we can restore, or we can make sure persist in areas and provide the same level of benefits and biodiversity that they're currently doing, or perhaps a slightly different version of them. So I would never say we could give up on restoration, but there are times when you want to consider what you're restoring and where, and it might be a better idea to pause that if that population is just not adapted to the new warm temperatures, and it's perhaps a wasted effort if you're outplanting a population that will just die in the new conditions.
That makes sense. So I don't want to get too technical, but one of the best tools for coral restoration is taking advantage of genetic diversity. So more heat-tolerant species or coral with more heat-tolerant symbionts are being used for more successful restoration efforts. Is there current consideration for using kelp species better equipped to tolerate heat, or maybe species less vulnerable to urchins or anything along those lines?
There is, and it's really exciting in kelp forests because unlike coral, their generation time is incredibly fast. So if you think about, if you find a certain trait or characteristic in one population and you want to kind of select for that, you can do that quite a few times over just 10 years. Whereas, with coral, it might take a fair bit longer. And so it's actually sometimes not even finding different species, but it's just finding different populations within those species. So take the east coast of Australia, for instance. We have one species, Aclonia radiata, or golden kelp, that lives all the way up in Brisbane, which is pretty much just tropical, 25-degree water, and then all the way south down to Tasmania, which is as cold as you're going to get in Australia, 8-10-degree water. Same species, just different adaptation. So we think that we can start to find these kind of gene sequences that are responsible for that adaptation within these populations, and then use that to adapt to new conditions.
Let's talk about, I think, the first major study you led that really had global impact was just reminding people of, that it's this rainforest of the sea, that the kelp forests have a value you estimated around $500 billion a year. And what gives it this great value?
It was an interesting exercise because people kind of intrinsically knew that kelp forests were valuable, at least the people who were aware of them, and that they're necessary for the health of the ocean and the benefits that people take from the ocean. But as you say, this was the first kind of attempt to put a dollar value on that global contribution to the economy. And so we looked at the things that you can most easily classify into dollar values. So things like the fish that you catch that are grown in the kelp forest, or the nutrients that are removed from the water that would otherwise have to be paid to be removed, or the value of carbon that would be captured from the atmosphere and might be traded on a carbon market. And so pound for pound, the nutrient removal is the most valuable service because removing excess nitrogen from water is incredibly expensive. And so if kelp forests are able to take that up, that saves a lot of money on land. And then second was fisheries in terms of dollar values. And there's just a rich diversity of fisheries tied to kelp forests around the world, from different sport fish, lobster, abalone, all linked to kelp forests in varying ways. And then interestingly, carbon, it was similar, again, pound for pound, kind of similar sequestration amount to seagrass or terrestrial forests in terms of how much carbon per hectare or per square mile that would be sequestered. But the dollar value wasn't as high just because we don't price the value of carbon that high. You know, you might get $50 a ton for CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And so kelp forests removing 4 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, then you're only about $200 for that 100 meter by 100 meter area.
When I was visiting a mussel farmer up in Maine for the book, he is growing kelp all around his floats because he said it had a halo effect, that it was removing the excess carbon dioxide from ocean acidification, that his mussel shells were stronger. And of course, kelp's also the mother seed for the whole 40 million ton a year seaweed industry, or at least a good portion of it. Plus, as you were saying, the marine wildlife we eat. I opened the first chapter on a salmon river in Alaska because people don't realize rockfish and salmon and cod and herring are dependent in their life cycles on those kelp forests. So talk a little more about how widespread kelp is in the world. I think people also don't appreciate that.
Well, they really are the threads of our cold water oceans. And as you say, they're linked to all these species that we don't necessarily realize depend on or interact with kelp forests. So over a third of our world's coastlines is dominated by a kelp forest, and that's essentially the coastline outside the tropics. And that's an incredible diversity of coastline from Japan to Argentina, South Africa, Northern Europe, the Western United States, parts of the Eastern United States and Canada, Southern Australia, New Zealand, some really wild, far-flung kelp forests on like subantarctic islands or the Western Arctic Peninsula, up in the Russian Arctic, Canadian Arctic, all kelp forests, all doing kind of similar things. And, you know, we're talking about the economic value, but then there's all these non-economic values of kelp forests that people can't and perhaps shouldn't put a dollar value on, for cultural connection to those species or those healthy oceans, or the recreation value that we derive from going kayaking near a kelp forest, or seeing the animals that depend on them, or just knowing they exist, or they really are supporting the ocean in so many of these places. This 1/3 of the world's coastline is propped up and supported by these rainforests of the sea in these coastal environments. So the diversity of kelp is incredible. Now you get kelp that are 30 centimeters high to 30 meters high, and some have gas-filled bladders, some have really rigid kind of trunks. It's incredible. You just need to kind of peek behind the curtain, and then you start pulling on the thread, and everything is connected to it.
What is Rising Tide? Rising Tide is Blue Frontier's bi-weekly half-hour show that features a diversity of ocean voices, from the famous to the fascinating, deep-sea explorers to whale wranglers, Arctic residents to climate justice warriors. With public broadcasting under attack, Blue Frontier offers Rising Tide and all associated content for free to community and public radio stations across the nation. We need your support to keep producing our salty, in-depth conversations. A tax-deductible donation at bluefront.org will help us keep getting the word out about our awesome blue planet. And now, back to the show.
It's funny. People know about rainforests, they know about coral reefs. You say coral reef, people say Great Barrier Reef. You say rainforest, they might say Amazon, or, they don't, very few people say, the Kelp Highway or the Great Southern Reef or the forest at the end of the world, the Great African coral. What's your theory? Why are people unfamiliar with kelp
Well,
forests?
I blame Jacques Cousteau primarily. When people were first being introduced into the underwater world, scuba diving originated in warm water, probably because it's easiest, and it is easiest to go diving in warm water. But that was people's first kind of anchoring with the ocean, was these early documentaries that took people into coral reefs. And that this kind of became the shortcut in people's minds, like, oh, ocean equals coral reef. And then that just sort of proliferated forward. And it is, a bit trickier to go diving in the kelp forest. You might need a wetsuit or a thicker wetsuit or even a dry suit in some really cold places. And so there's a slightly higher barrier to entry. And you have people then go on vacation to Fiji or the Caribbean or Indonesia, and they go diving on a coral reef because it's easy, it's affordable. But they have a kelp forest in their backyard that they're not necessarily aware of. And so there is this kind of disconnect between that proximity and that awareness as well. So it's a tricky one, but we're starting to, I think, turn that tide, and through things like documentaries, photo awards, wonderful books written by people such as yourself, and make people aware that they don't have to fly 10,000 kilometers to see an underwater metropolis. They've got one right in their blue backyard, whether they're in London or Los Angeles or Sydney or Tokyo.
And you're right. It's easy, warm, and clear to go into a coral reef, but they're such fragile little animals. You can't touch anything, and kelp diving is like a full contact sport. You're
It's
in
an
there,
interactive.
and
Yeah, it's like a 4-dimensional experience. You can really get in. You can pull into the kelp. You can free dive, pulling yourself down to the bottom, and just kind of sit there in total silence and look up through the canopy as the sun bounces around between the blades and all the little critters make their way in and around you. So it's an incredible experience that I think anyone who loves scuba diving needs to try.
Absolutely. It's dark, and suddenly it's light, and it's like there's beams, flashing. It's like you're in a cathedral or Sherwood Forest, and suddenly there's a, harbor seal chewing on your flippers, or you're distracted by a shark and suddenly you're entangled and the kelp's pulling on your stipes or pulling on your regulator. It's always an adventure.
So, Aaron, you're also a photographer. And as we just established, people generally will dive or snorkel recreationally in warm water more than they will in cold water habitats like kelp forests. Do you find that visual art like your photography helps to build awareness and support for an issue like kelp conservation that might otherwise be out of sight for the general public? And then also, how did you get into photography?
I think it absolutely does, particularly with something where people just are unaware. I think there can be a bit of fatigue with photography and conservation. The same issue photographed over and over and over again. But with kelp forests, it's introducing people to this ecosystem, this living being, this web of living beings that they're just totally unaware of, and it becomes this like light bulb moment where they're like, I never knew this existed, or if I did know it existed, I thought it was like sushi, but it's actually this thriving ecosystem web of life that again is just right next door to where I live. And so we hosted the Kelp Forest Photo Awards 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. And that was a really incredible experience because we got so many different entries from 18 countries around the world highlighting that diversity. So even people that thought maybe they knew kelp realized that they didn't know it in its true, extravagant, diverse forms. And so photography has been really powerful that way, and storytelling with photography or short videos as well, and introducing people and telling the stories about the people as well who rely on these ecosystems. So personally, I got into photography I don't know if I can exactly explain why. I just like the idea of kind of capturing the natural world in a way that I could look back on and kind of hold on to as that memory of something that I got to experience. And perhaps with underwater, it's even more special because, we're limited in the time we get to spend underwater, whether it's your free diving breath or your scuba tank or just getting too cold. You have to come out sometime. And it's usually, not more than an hour or two, maybe three if you're really in a comfortable snorkeling wetsuit. So the photograph becomes that thing that you can take with you.
With coral and kelp being sort of the ebony and ivory of large marine ecosystems, and these marine heat waves, these, like we had in California, the blob that came in 2013 and took out 95% of our bull kelp. The increased heat seems to be major factors as threats to kelp forests go. And how do you view that as a problem, and how do we address it, obviously beyond getting off fossil fuels and as soon as we can?
It is a major problem, and it again goes to illustrate this interconnectedness we have between the kelp itself, the problems that they face, and the sort of solutions and benefits they provide to people. So we can kick the fossil fuel habit, and that will go a long way. But then we can start thinking about, as we were talking about earlier, those warm adapted populations that might be able to do better in the new conditions, or improving the general health of the kelp forest. So when a marine heat wave does come along, it's more resilient, it's better able to survive. So we need to come up with these kind of portfolio of solutions, and that's improving the water quality, that's increasing the amount of sea otters or the amount of lobsters or the reducing the number of urchins. And so when these marine heat wave events do happen, the kelp's in better health and is able to persist better than it might have been able to otherwise.
Now, you've advocated for marine protected areas to keep healthy kelp forest intact, but you also just put out another major report. You were the lead author on one that looks at global restoration efforts going on around kelp forests. And maybe you could tell us a little about that report and what you found.
We absolutely, we need both. We need to protect what we have and what we can, and we need to restore what's been lost, because the reality is that protection alone isn't enough, and marine protected areas are wonderful and play their part. But in places where kelp forests have disappeared, and us simply taking our foot off the pedal isn't going to result in them coming back, we need to think about how can we get in there, how can we intervene and restore these systems. And so you can plant kelp, you can seed it, you can remove those sea urchins. And the paper that we just published was this first really collaborative grassroots review of the state of kelp restoration and conservation in 38 regions around the world, essentially everywhere that we have a kelp forest. There were 138 authors that contributed to the paper and produced this sort of up-to-date synthesis of what's happening, where, when, why, how, related to kelp. In some places, it's doing really well, like southern Argentina or Iceland. Their kelp forests are quite healthy. Other places, we have crisis regimes like California or Tasmania, where we've lost these big bits of the population, 95% of bull kelp in Northern California, 95% of giant kelp in Tasmania, and people are working a lot more on active restoration efforts or lobbying government. Other places have big state-led programs, state as in the country. Japan and Korea have really invested in national kelp restoration programs that are scaled up across the country, well-funded, regularly funded for multiple years, and connecting the local fishing groups to participate in those efforts. So there's just so many different ways that people care for or link to or interact with kelp forests. And what we try to do with this paper in the Kelp Forest Alliance is bring all of that together and tell those stories and illustrate the diversity and find those commonalities that people can work on together and celebrate those differences that might make certain regions unique.
So you started the Kelp Forest Alliance as well as the Kelp Forest Challenge. Is there an international governing body that can help implement global restoration efforts and the Kelp Forest Challenge, or will it mostly be dependent on volunteers and local efforts knit together?
We've created the challenge and the alliance to really be open to anyone. So we've got it so an individual can volunteer their time or their skills or their knowledge to help conserve or promote kelp forests, or businesses can get involved with their resources or their networks to help promote kelp conservation, or governments as well. So there's all sorts of ways for people to link in, or larger organizations to link in.
There's a global demand to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. What are the numbers attached to the global kelp challenge?
The Kelp Forest Challenge is a mission to protect and restore 4 million hectares of kelp forest by 2040 and raise $14 billion for global kelp conservation also by 2040. And acknowledging
billion with a B.
With a B.
Right.
The big B.
Again, to protect $500 billion a year in goods and services.
It's an easy maths trade-off when you really do the numbers and you understand just how much coastline these ecosystems are supporting.
So all you need is the constituency that can encourage governments to act. You gave the example of South Korea, where they invest 29 million a year, and they've brought back 50,000 acres of kelp, and they aim for 125,000 acres in 4 years from now. And because they understand it's about food security. So the challenge, and you're meeting it, and the Kelp Forest Alliance, and hopefully with my Forest of the Sea book and our Sequoias of the Sea documentary, we may be at a turning point where people start thinking of kelp forests the way they think of terrestrial forests, essential for our survival.
I think we're getting there. California is looking at its own Kelp Act, Kelp Management Plan, and conservation target. The same is happening in Norway, starting to kind of plant the seeds in Australia, South Africa, the UK, Canada, and making it happen. And to the international question before, we'll be attending the Climate COP and the Biodiversity COP. These are big UN-led events where countries come together to negotiate biodiversity strategies and climate change strategies. And we're just starting now to get country-level champions talking about kelp forests, and we'll hopefully have more come on board. And they ultimately hold a lot of the levers of power and finance that are required to take the action that we're advocating for or suggesting needs to occur.
Well, Aaron Eger, thank you so much for the work you do and for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Leave us a review and share Rising Tide with your friends. Follow us on Instagram and check out bluefront.org for more ocean resources and connections. Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with support from producer Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, editing services by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May, and additional support from Blue Frontier's Natasha Benjamin and Nick Paz. This is Joy Leilei Shikazado of Blue Frontier, asking you to stay hopeful and stay salty.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the Blue Frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the Blue Frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky. There you are. Good boy, Sparky.